They were called the families. They lived by a code older than the country itself, and for nearly a century, they ran America from the shadows. Every week, we open the files on the men who built the underworld, the bosses, the wars, the rituals, the betrayals, the blood oaths that bound them, and the secrets they swore to take to the grave. Subscribe. Some stories were never meant to be told.
The Irish-American Mob, a historical overview. Picture the scene. We are in the early years of the 21st century, an era dominated by global paranoia, and yet the highest-ranking organized crime figure on the FBI's 10 most wanted list is not a Russian oligarch or a Latin cartel lord. He is James Whitey Bulger, an old-style Irish-American mob boss from the gritty neighborhood of South Boston. Bulger was a walking cinematic trope straight out of an old James Cagney film. He was a tough but sentimental neighborhood guy who was kind to his mother, but he was also a ruthless sociopath who murdered at least 19 people. For over 20 years, from the early 1970s until he went on the lam in 1995, Bulger ruled his Southie territory, raking in millions through racketeering and getting away with murder by expertly manipulating the criminal justice system. He operated with an impunity that would have made the most powerful Italian Mafia bosses weep with pure envy. While J. Edgar Hoover and his federal agents were aggressively hunting down La Cosa Nostra and putting the Italians in the national headlines, the Irish mobsters deliberately flew below the radar. The Irish survived by keeping their operations small and strictly local, adhering to underworld parameters that had been established for over a century. Bulger's untouchable status wasn't just a stroke of luck, it was built on a foundation of political and law enforcement corruption, specifically having a compromised FBI agent in his pocket and his own younger brother sitting as a powerful Massachusetts state senator. To his community, Bulger played the role of the neighborhood godfather, doling out holiday turkeys to the needy, doing favors for his constituents, and settling local disputes with an iron fist. But to truly understand the vicious DNA of the Irish-American mob, you have to look past the streets of South Boston and cross the ocean to the Emerald Isle. Forget the popular misconception that American organized crime was exclusively an Italian institution transported from Sicily. The Irish were already deeply entrenched in the U.S. underworld a full 40 years before the Italians arrived. The seeds of this criminal empire were planted in the dreary, oppressive soil of 19th-century Ireland, where the native people lived as virtual slaves under the British Crown. Faced with the constant threat of eviction and banned from speaking their native Gaelic language, the Irish formed secret resistance societies like the White Boys, the Ribbon Men, and the Molly Maguires. These underground groups used sabotage and guerrilla violence against their British landlords, acting as fierce custodians of their communities while simultaneously preying upon their own people. Then came the cataclysm that permanently scarred the Irish psyche, the Great Potato Famine. This wasn't just a terrible crop failure, it was a politically mismanaged genocide driven by British overlords who blamed the mass starvation on the supposedly turbulent character of the Irish people. The horrors were unimaginable, with one archdeacon reporting daily spectacles of women and children crawling out of their homes on all fours to beg for a morsel of food beside the corpses of their loved ones. Over 1 million people starved to death, while another 1.5 million fled the country, piling into disease-ridden coffin ships. They carried with them a legacy of deep-seated bitterness, shame, desperation, and famine-related dementia. When these traumatized refugees washed up in America's bustling cities, they relied on their innate sociability to survive. The local saloon, the parish hall, and the political clubhouse became the headquarters of a new, fierce immigrant dynasty. In New York, the Irish swarmed upstream and infiltrated Tammany Hall, transforming what was originally a fraternal organization into a ferocious political machine. Irish immigrants became precinct captains, ward bosses, and aldermen, injecting raw energy into an elaborate system that dispensed favors in exchange for absolute loyalty at the ballot box. Organized crime grew directly out of this ruthless political apparatus, symbolized by the ferocious Tammany Tiger. The early street gangs were not independent crime syndicates, they were the hired muscle for the politicians, unleashed on election day to bash heads and police the polling sites. This vast subterranean universe of illegal gambling, prostitution, and street-level extortion became the bedrock of organized crime in the United States. The balance of power between the politicians and the thugs didn't permanently shift until the arrival of Prohibition. Suddenly, illegal booze provided a single, dominating racket that generated so much cash that the gangsters stopped taking orders from the politicians and started calling the shots themselves. For the Irish-American mobsters, this was the ultimate glory era, transforming cities like New York and Chicago into the epicenters of a vast, corrupt universe where the gangster became a cultural archetype. But the glory days came to a crashing halt with the end of Prohibition and the arrival of the New Deal, which ushered in political reforms and corruption scandals that broke the back of the old machines. In the years following World War II, the Irish gangsters were forced to scatter far and wide. Many found a new home cracking skulls in the labor movement as enforcers for the International Longshoremen's Association or the Teamsters, while others devolved into notorious hitmen for hire, carrying out murder contracts for the Italian Mafia. One Irish-American hitman of the era even casually referred to his gruesome murder-for-hire jobs as simple carpentry work. Working-class hoods who specialized in kidnapping, safecracking, and body disposal often wound up on the losing end of long, bloody turf wars with the vastly larger and more organized Italian crime families. Those who stayed loyal to the old-school, neighborhood-based Irish gangs, like New York's Westies and Whitey Bulger's Winter Hill Gang in Boston, found themselves trapped in a violent time warp. By the end of the 20th century, the Irish mob was thrashing in its death throes, engaging in a macabre, paranoid, and utterly self-destructive spiral of internalized violence. Yet, the dark allure of the Irish-American gangster endures as the ultimate, twisted metaphor for American capitalism. The gangster openly defies the laws of polite society, revels in immediate gratification, and lives entirely by his own rules, acting as judge, jury, and executioner in his own private kingdom. Born out of starvation, disease, and bigotry, the Irish-American mobster wrote the original bloody playbook for organized crime, plying their lethal trade with an audacity and panache that will forever scar the American dream. Step right onto the muddy, blood-soaked streets of 1849 New York City, where a teenage Irish punk named John Morrissey is about to write the original playbook for the American gangster. Picture an 18-year-old street brawler arriving from the upstate town of Troy with nothing but the clothes on his back and a rap sheet that already included burglary, assault with intent to kill, and a 60-day stint in the county jail. Driven by a relentless, violent ambition that couldn't be contained in a small town, Morrissey marched straight into the belly of the beast, the Empire Club on Park Row in Lower Manhattan. This wasn't just any gambling parlor, it was the nerve center of Captain Isaiah Rynders, a legendary political fixer and employer of hundreds of thugs, saloon keepers, and operatives for the Democratic Party. Morrissey didn't ask for a job, he stood overlooking the gaming tables and boldly announced, "I'm here to say I can lick any man in this place." Captain Rynders just smiled his famous Mona Lisa smile and nodded to his men. A brutal melee erupted with fists, bottles, and slung shots, ending only when a massive enforcer named Big Tom Burns smashed a spittoon into the back of Morrissey's skull, knocking the brash kid out cold. But when Morrissey woke up on a cot with a knot the size of an acorn on his head, Rynders didn't throw him in the gutter. Impressed by the kid's sheer audacity, he hired him on the spot as a political shoulder hitter and immigrant runner. Morrissey was sent to work the Castle Garden Wharf, where disease-ridden coffin ships disgorged starving Irish peasants fleeing the Great Potato Famine. Watching his countrymen arrive weak from dropsy and starvation struck a chord in the young gangster's heart, but it was also a prime opportunity for extortion. Working the razor-thin line between charity and exploitation, Morrissey directed the desperate refugees to soup kitchens and boarding houses controlled by the Rynders political machine. In exchange for a hot meal and a bed, these immigrants signed voter cards, pledging their absolute loyalty to the organization. Come election day, it was Morrissey's job to ensure those votes were delivered, using the threat of raw violence if anyone dared to step out of line. With the money he made, the young enforcer took up residence in 5 Points, a notorious slum dominating the 6th Ward at the lower tip of Manhattan. The district was a literal cesspool, built unsteadily on landfill over a former sewage pond known as the Collect. It was a neighborhood of unparalleled squalor and depravity, anchored by the Old Brewery, America's first tenement building. This 5-story monstrosity housed desperate immigrants in stifling, overcrowded conditions that served as a breeding ground for massive cholera epidemics. The basement of the Old Brewery, chillingly dubbed the Den of Thieves, was a lawless nightmare of illegal gambling, dog fights, prostitution, and murder. It was a place so relentlessly violent that years later, when the building was finally demolished, construction workers allegedly hauled out bags of human bones belonging to victims who had been secretly buried beneath the floorboards and inside the walls. The streets outside were no better, swarming with pickpockets, sneak thieves, and drunks stumbling out of speakeasies only to be jackrolled by gangs of prepubescent hoodlums. Charles Dickens himself visited Five Points in 1841 and described it as a suffocating world of ruined houses, knee-deep mud, and hideous tenements reeking of vice, robbery, and murder. This hellish landscape was the ultimate proving ground for the city's street gangs. Morrissey already knew the gang life, having led a teenage crew of Irish and German hooligans called the Downtowns back in Troy, where they frequently engaged in bloody turf wars with a nativist, American-born gang known as the Uptowns. But the violence in 5 Points was on a completely different level. Fists and traditional Irish oaken cudgels were obsolete here. These gangsters fought with hatchets, tomahawks, spiked clubs, brass knuckles, and muskets. The neighborhood's central gathering spot, Paradise Square, was dominated by vicious Irish street gangs with names like the 40 Thieves, the Shirtdales, the Plug Uglies, and the legendary Dead Rabbits. These gangs were massive, loosely organized crews of famine refugees whose names often derived from bastardized Gaelic. The Dead Rabbits, for instance, likely took their name from Dead Ray Bed, meaning a very big galoot. When these gangs clashed, the carnage was staggering. Fights often escalated into multi-day riots with barricaded streets and blazing firearms, requiring the National Guard to restore order. The combat wasn't restricted to men, either. Take Hellcat Maggie, a terrifying 20-year-old woman who fought alongside the Dead Rabbits. She was known to file her teeth into sharp mini daggers and wear long, metal artificial nails on her fingers, screaming like a banshee as she descended on rival gang members to bite and claw their flesh until she was drenched in their blood. In this sprawling, disorganized powder keg of immigrant rage, John Morrissey saw his path to power. By mid-1851, the ambitious young gangster had saved enough of his illicit political earnings to buy a part ownership in the Gem Saloon, a crucial first step for anyone looking to launch a serious career in the underworld and politics. He also began to heavily promote his aspirations as a professional bare-knuckle boxer. His legendary underworld moniker was born during a savage, impromptu brawl in the basement shooting gallery of the St. Charles Hotel. Morrissey squared off against Tom McCann, an American-born thug affiliated with the rival Bowery Boys gang. During the vicious fight, McCann managed to pin the young Irishman directly against a stove filled with burning coals. As Morrissey's clothes literally sizzled and smoked, and the horrifying stench of burning flesh filled the room, the tough-as-nails gangster never uttered a single word of complaint. Using the agonizing pain to fuel his resolve, he broke free from McCann's grasp and mercilessly whipped his rival into absolute submission. From that day forward, the undisputed, pain-defying champion of the 5 Points underworld was known respectfully to friend and foe alike as Old Smoke. The dark history of the American underworld. Listen up, because the dark, blood-soaked history of the American underworld didn't start with the Italians, it started in the squalid, disease-ridden streets of New York's 5 Points with the invention of the mob boss. In the mid-19th century, this title didn't refer to a shadowy godfather pulling strings from a velvet chair, it came from a highly physical, spontaneous brand of politics known as the mob primary. Picture an aspiring political leader, usually a local saloon keeper, standing on a milk crate or a soapbox in the middle of a muddy street, screaming at the top of his lungs until he gathered a formidable crowd, or mob. This order would offer the desperate onlookers a free drink, a sandwich, or a dirty cellar mattress to sleep on in exchange for their signature on a petition and their absolute loyalty at the ballot box. The type of men willing to sell their votes for a sandwich were the roughest characters the slums had to offer: homeless drifters, violent thieves, and street gangsters. Thus, the leader of this unsavory constituency became the original mob boss. For the criminals, this was a match made in underworld heaven. By aligning themselves with the rising political boss, the street hoodlums became mobsters, officially connected to a system that granted them the ultimate prize, protection. With the political machine watching their backs, these thugs could safely operate illegal gambling dens, prostitution rings, and unlicensed speakeasies without interference from the law. It was a brilliant, deeply corrupt subterranean universe where the upper world of politics and the underworld of vice were intrinsically, permanently intertwined. Before the Irish took the reins, the undisputed king of this racket in the 1840s was Captain Isaiah Rynders. Operating out of the Empire Club, Rynders established a sprawling network of saloons and gambling parlors that funded his political machine, achieving national infamy in 1844 when he virtually delivered the presidency to Democratic candidate James K. Polk through sheer, physical voter fraud. But Captain Rynders had one major flaw in the eyes of his constituents: he wasn't an Irish Catholic. With a German-American father and an Irish Protestant mother, Rinders simply didn't represent the massive waves of Catholic famine immigrants who were rapidly filling the ranks of the city's street gangs and political wards. These desperate masses clamored for one of their own to lead them, and the streets eventually provided their answer in the form of unparalleled violence. The boiling point arrived on Independence Day, 1857, touching off the Great Riot. The streets of Five Points erupted in a savage, multi-day war between the Dead Rabbits and the nativist Bowery Boys. Gangsters barricaded the streets with carts and blazed away with muskets, while others brawled in the gutters with brickbats and bludgeons. The carnage was so horrific that police and eventually the National Guard had to be called in, clubbing gangsters up tenement stairs and tossing them off roofs to be stomped to death by their rivals below. Out of the ashes and blood of this legendary riot arose the first true Irish mob boss in American history, John "Old Smoke" Morrissey. Morrissey knew that the secret elixir fueling the entire underworld, and the politicians who relied on its muscle, was gambling. He aggressively expanded his empire, operating grimy dens for the poor where they played policy and craps, and upscale parlors for the rich featuring roulette and faro. His greatest triumph came when he traveled to the pristine resort town of Saratoga Springs, New York, and opened the majestic Saratoga Clubhouse, widely considered the finest gaming establishment in the nation. When local temperance reformists tried to shut his casino down, the wily mob boss effortlessly neutralized them by showering the town, its churches, and its civic organizations with lavish payoffs. As one local columnist admired, Morrissey divided the profits of his sinning with the good people of the village using a very generous hand. The Saratoga Clubhouse made Old Smoke fabulously wealthy, and he wasn't shy about showing it off. Morrissey essentially invented mobster chic, strutting through town with a neatly manicured black beard, a diamond-studded cravat, sparkling rings, a swallowtail dinner jacket, a beaver pelt overcoat, and a mink bowler hat. He even rode around in the 19th century equivalent of a pink Cadillac, a custom-built, gold-embroidered carriage that cost over $2,000. Yet, for all his garish wealth, Morrissey harbored a deep, desperate desire to be accepted by the WASP aristocracy. He rubbed elbows with immensely wealthy industrialists like Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt and August Belmont at his casino, mistakenly believing he could buy his way into their elite social circles. The aristocrats quickly put the gangster in his place. Vanderbilt intentionally fed Morrissey a bogus stock tip that cost the mobster thousands, and a syndicate led by Belmont bought prime real estate right out from under him to keep him out of their neighborhood. It was a brutal wake-up call for Old Smoke. Beyond the gold leaf walls of his casino, the elite still viewed him as just another dirty paddy. Realizing that high society would never accept him, Morrissey turned his focus back to the one arena where raw power trumped pedigree, politics. Calling in every underworld shit he had, he got himself elected to the United States Congress in 1868 and won re-election by a landslide 2 years later. He aligned his fortunes with William Marcy Tweed, the infamous Grand Sachem of Tammany Hall. Boss Tweed, a native-born Presbyterian, desperately needed Morrissey as his Celtic liaison to secure the massive Irish Catholic vote. With Old Smoke delivering the ballots through intimidation and fraud, Tweed's inner circle, known as the Ring, proceeded to ruthlessly plunder New York City. Over an 8-year stretch, the Tweed Ring siphoned off a staggering $50 million from the municipal government, the equivalent of at least $500 million today, through rampant graft, rigged bids, and illegal vice proceeds. But there is no honor among thieves. When the law finally caught up with Boss Tweed in the early 1870s, uncovering his massive criminal enterprise, the disgraced kingpin eventually turned state's evidence to save his own skin. In 1877, Tweed publicly testified against his former protégé, identifying John Morrissey as a pioneer of mass voter fraud, a bag man for the Ring, and the proprietor of the absolute worst, lowest character criminal resorts in New York City. Tweed's betrayal destroyed Morrissey's political ambitions. Ostracized by the new Tammany leadership, the once invincible mob boss tried to form a rival political organization, but his personal life was already in a fatal tailspin. Ravaged by severe alcoholism and early-onset dementia brought about by years of bare-knuckle boxing, his immune system collapsed. On May 1, 1877, after weeks of being bedridden with pneumonia, Old Smoke cried out in his sleep and died at the age of just 47. Though his end was miserable, John Morrissey had successfully written the original, bloody blueprint for organized crime in America, proving that a street thug could combine physical brutality with legitimate political influence to rise from the absolute gutter and conquer the world.